Hey everybody, this video is called Protecting Jerusalem, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2 Chronicles, where we're going to be looking at God protecting Jerusalem. So we're going to be in the 32nd chapter as we're moving closer to the end of this book. And verse 1 starts out, "After these deeds of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and entered Judah. He encamped against the fortified cities, thinking to win them over to himself." So today's chapter focuses on Hezekiah's dealings with the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, who ruled between 705 to 681 BC. And you can find the parallel passage of this back in 2 Kings chapter 18, verse 13 through 19, and also the prophet Isaiah's account given in Isaiah chapter 36 and Isaiah chapter 37. And the Assyrian king came from Hezekiah, determined to recover the independence of his nation. And he refused to pay tribute to his father had bound him to pay to Assyria. And the chronicler is given a shorter account here. He's using it to illustrate the divine blessing be granted because of fidelity, trust, and prayer. And it was 701 BC, the 4th year of his reign, that the Assyrian emperor embarked on a campaign to retake Judah. And the chronicler does not cover what 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 13 through 16 gives us, where Hezekiah unwisely and unsuccessfully tried to satisfy Sennacherib with gold and treasures from the temple. And it did not work, and after conquering nearly all the fortified cities in Judah, the king of Assyria prepared to set a siege against Jerusalem. In verse 2 through 8 says, "And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib had come, and that his purpose was to make war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his leaders and commanders to stop the water from the springs which were outside the city, and they helped him. Thus many people gathered together, who stopped all the springs and the brook that ran through the land, saying, 'Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water?' And he strengthened himself, built up all the wall that was broken, raised it up to the towers, and built another wall outside. Also he repaired the millow in the city of David, and made weapons and shields in abundance. Then he set military captains over the people, gathered them together to him in the open square of the city gate, and gave them encouragement, saying, 'Be strong and courageous, do not be afraid nor dismayed before the king of Assyria, nor before all the multitude that is with him, for there are more with us than with him. And with him is an arm of flesh, but with us the Lord our God to help us to fight our battles.' And the people were strengthened by the words of Hezekiah, the king of Judah." So the water supply is Jerusalem's weak spot in the seas, because the springs were outside of the walls. And in verse 5, the raised towers upon it, archaeological evidence suggests that these towers weren't on top of the walls, but they were freestanding between two walls designed to protect the water supplies. And the millow is a filled area between the temple area and the city of David. In verses 7 through 8, Hezekiah's speech demonstrates that his full reliance on divine power to overcome his great enemy. And Hezekiah understood that the defense of Israel didn't depend only on walls and towers, shields and water supplies, but it also depended on strength and courage and determination of their soldiers. In verse 9 through 19 says, "After this, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, sent his servants to Jerusalem, but he and all the forces with him laid siege against Lachish to Hezekiah, king of Judah, and to all Judah who were in Jerusalem, saying, 'Thus says Sennacherib, king of Assyria, in what do you trust, that you remain under siege in Jerusalem? Does not Hezekiah persuade you to give yourselves over to die by famine and by thirst, saying, The Lord our God will deliver us from the hand of the king of Assyria?' Has not the same Hezekiah taken away his high places and his altars, and commanded Judah and Jerusalem, saying, You shall worship before one altar and burn incense on it? Do you not know that what I and my fathers have done to all the peoples of other lands? Were the gods of the nations of those lands in any way able to deliver their lands out of my hand? Who was there among all the gods of those nations that my fathers utterly destroyed, that could deliver his people from my hand, that your God should be able to deliver you from my hand? Now therefore do not let Hezekiah deceive you, or persuade you like this, and do not believe him, for no God of any nation or kingdom was able to deliver his people from my hand, or from the hand of my fathers. How much less will your God deliver you from my hand? Furthermore, his servant spoke against the Lord God and against his servant Hezekiah. He also wrote letters to revile the Lord God of Israel, and to speak against him, saying, As the gods of the nations of other lands have not delivered their people from my hand, so the God of Hezekiah will not deliver his people from my hand. Then they called out with a loud voice in Hebrew to the people of Jerusalem who were on the wall, to frighten them and to trouble them, that they might take the city. And they spoke against the God of Jerusalem as against the gods of the people of the earth, the works of men's hands. So, verse 9 through 19, we see Lachish as a location. It's about 30 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And archaeologists have discovered a pit there that remains with the 1,500 casualties of Sennacherib's attack. And a British museum has the Assyrian carving depicting their siege of the city of Lachish, which was an important fortress in the city of Judah. And 2 Kings 18:17 tells us of the servants of Sennacherib, such as Tartan, Rabsaris, and Rabshakeh, tried to shake the trust of Hezekiah and the people of Israel, or Jerusalem, had in the Lord. And Hezekiah, he put his hope in the alliance of Egypt, and the Assyrians wanted him to lose confidence in that alliance. And it was a great temptation for Hezekiah during this time to make a defensive alliance with Egypt, which seemed to be the only strong nation enough to protect Judah against the mighty Assyrians. And as a prophet, Isaiah did everything he could to discourage Hezekiah and the leaders of Judah from putting their trust in man and Egypt, back in Isaiah chapter 19 verse 11 through 14, Isaiah chapter 20 verse 1 through 6, and Isaiah chapter 30 verse 1 through 7. And the Lord wanted Judah to trust him instead of Egypt. And the Assyrian accuser knew that King Hezekiah had implemented broad reforms in Judah, including removing the high places, as we see in 2 Kings chapter 18 verse 3 and 4. Yet in the Assyrian thinking, Hezekiah's reforms had really displeased God, so he shouldn't expect help from the Lord God of Israel. And the Assyrians, they used demonic logic in his argument. And the Assyrian speech was intended to destroy their trust in their God. And his message was simple and brilliant in a satanic logic. And like a knucklehead, we see that Sennacherib mocks the everlasting God, the God of Israel, counting him as just another god like a pagan god. In verse 20 through 23 says, Now because of this, King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, prayed and cried out to heaven. Then the Lord sent an angel who cut down every man of valor, leader and captain in the camp of the king of Assyria. So he returned shamefaced to his own land. And when he had gone into the temple of his God, some of his own offspring struck him down with a sword there. Thus the Lord saved Hezekiah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem from the hand of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, and from the hand of all others, and guided them on every side. And as many brought gifts to the Lord at Jerusalem, and presents to Hezekiah, king of Judah, so that he was exalted in the sight of all the nations thereafter. So when you go back to 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 1 through 5, it gives more detail about this beautiful prayer of King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah. And they prayed humbly. And in verses 6 and 7 in the Kings, Isaiah brought assurance of this answer to this prayer to Hezekiah. And in verse 21, struck him down occurred in 681 BC, where God had destroyed this mighty army of the Assyrians in one night. And 185,000 died at the hand of the angel of the Lord, as 2 Kings 19 verse 35 says. So I challenge you to go back and look at 2 Kings chapter 18 and 2 Kings chapter 19 with this video or afterward. And against all odds, expectation, the Assyrian army was turned back without even having shot an arrow into Jerusalem. And this mighty military was stopped. The undefeated was defeated. And the prophet Hosea made the same prediction in Hosea chapter 1 verse 7. And Greek historian Herodotus claimed one night that Sennacherib's army camp was infested with mice or rats that destroyed the arrows and shield thongs of the soldiers. And he likely got the tradition from Egyptian sources, a distorted version of events. An Old Testament professor in the 20th century, Barton Payne, he calls this event, along with the other Old Testament stories of the cross and the Red Sea, as the two greatest examples of the Lord's intervention of God for his people in the Old Testament. And after the retreat from Judah, Sennacherib commissioned a record which is preserved in the spectacular annals of Sennacherib Taylor's Prism, which can be seen at the British Museum. And it shows full of pride in his heart, even though he couldn't claim of having conquered Jerusalem. And English theologian Matthew Poole commented that God spared Sennacherib not in mercy, but in wrath, reserving to him more of a dreadful and shameful death by the hands of his own children, as seen in verse 21. And that's about 20 years after he returned. And then there's an old Jewish legend that claims that his sons came to kill him because he sacrificed 2 sons to find more favor from God than Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his one son, Isaac. And they learned of the plan, and they killed him before he could kill. And it's nothing more than a legend now. So whenever you hear legend, remember that it is pretty much like a fable. But verse 24 through 26 here says, in those days Hezekiah was sick and was near death, and he prayed to the Lord, and he spoke to him and gave him a sign. But Hezekiah did not repay according to the favor shown to him from his heart, and was lifted up. Therefore wrath was looming over him and over Judah and Jerusalem. Then Hezekiah humbled himself for the pride of his heart, he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. So you can get further information on this back in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 1 through 11 and Isaiah chapter 38. And this happened at a time of the Assyrian invasion of Judah, because Jerusalem had not been delivered from the Assyrian threat yet seen back in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 6. So also check out 2 Kings chapter 20. And we're not told how Hezekiah became sick. And the sign of the retreating sundoe is recorded in 2 Kings 20 verse 8 through 11. And Hezekiah did not receive this miracle with gratitude that he should have, yet he humbled himself for the pride of his heart and was saved a greater judgment. Verse 27 through 33, to wrap up the chapter, says, Hezekiah had great riches and honor, and he made himself treasures for silver, for gold, for precious stones, for spices, and for shields, and all kinds of desirable items, storehouses for the harvest of grain, wine, and oil, and stalls for all kinds of livestock, and folds for flocks. Moreover, he provided cities for himself, and possessions of flocks and herds, and abundance, for God had given him very much property. The same Hezekiah also stopped the water outlet of Upper Gihon, and brought the water by tunnel to the west side of the city of David. Hezekiah prospered in all his works. However, regarding the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, whom they sent to inquire about the wonder that had been done in the land, God withdrew of him in order to test him, that he might know all that was in his heart. Now the rest of the acts of Hezekiah, and his goodness, indeed they are written in the vision of Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, and in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. So Hezekiah rested with his fathers, and they buried him in the upper tombs of the sons of David, and all Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem honored him at his death. But then Manasseh his son reigned in his place. So the end of the chapter here is also covered in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 12 through 20 and Isaiah chapter 9. But we see in verse 30 a 1,700-foot tunnel cut through solid rock below Jerusalem, redirected water from the spring Gihon outside of Jerusalem and into the pool of Siloam within the city to provide water in the time of siege. And the tunnel was a remarkable feat of engineering and born skill, often 60 feet below the ground and large enough to walk through. And it was discovered in 1838, but not until 1909 that it was cleared of the debris left by the destruction of Jerusalem back in 586 BC. And this may not have been the first water shaft, since David may have entered Jerusalem 300 years earlier, though through a water shaft back in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 6 through 8. And the Babylonian Empire gradually gained power as Assyria declined due to the internal strife and weak kings. And Assyria was crushed in 612 BC, and Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar became the world ruler as seen in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 14. And the chronicler, he abbreviates the account in 2 Kings 20, assuming that his post-exilic readers are familiar with the king's account, and he leaves out Isaiah's harsh rebuke. And Hezekiah is tested whether he'll form a alliance with Babylon, and the king's author reports that Hezekiah fails the test in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 12 through 19. And in verse 32, the chronicler is likely referring to the book of Isaiah. There's no doubt about it, as Isaiah 1:1 called it a vision. And Hezekiah often generously used these great riches for good, as we saw in our last video Tuesday in verse 3. But sometimes he managed his in the kingdom's wealth foolishly in 2 Kings chapter 20 verse 12 through 21. And Hezekiah failed under a temptation common to many. And the temptation that I'm speaking about is the temptation of success. And he started godly, and overall he had a godly reign. But we see that he finishes poorly. In 2 Kings 20 verse 6 tells us that God gave Hezekiah the gift of 15 more years of life, but they didn't make him better, and they did not make him a godlier man. And time and age does not necessarily make us better. And time does nothing but pass away. That is the only thing that time is guaranteed. And people will say that time will tell, or time will heal, or time will bring out the potential in me. But time will do nothing of the sort. yes, sometimes, depending circumstances, maybe it is time that, that you need to build discernment about what is right and what's wrong. But time will heal doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. Losing a child with time, with grief, it doesn't mean you're going to heal completely of that in this realm. And it is how we use time that matters. And he was buried in the sloping hill where the tombs of David's descendants were cut. So to wrap up today's study here, we see that the chronicler talks on Sennacherib's attack as God protects Jerusalem from the Assyrians. And we saw that Hezekiah prepared against the coming and siege. And we see the propaganda campaign of Sennacherib in verses 9 through 19. In verses 20 through 23, we see Hezekiah's prayer and victory. And we go on to see the chronicler discuss the remainder of Hezekiah's reign as Hezekiah was humbled and God relented in verses 24 through 26. And the chronicler, he ends the chapter here with summarizing the reign of Hezekiah. And one nugget that I hope that you get out of this video today is to be cautious of the temptation of success and use your time wisely. So that will be the end of today's video. We'll see you next on Saturday as we'll be looking at the reigns of Manasseh and Ammon. God bless. We'll see you this weekend.